So good. So yeah, maybe just first comments on this first slide. I think the talk was presented or advertised as being mobility pricing in Switzerland. I realized in the meantime that the Swiss government has kindly asked us to no longer use the term mobility pricing, but rather transport pricing for political issues. So I'll try to make an effort in well, keeping it that way. But if I interchange between transport pricing and mobility pricing, they're basically the same thing. So traffic, or the demand for transportation rather, is on the rise in basically cities across the world. We have more and more people living in urban settings, more people living further away from where they work, so having to commute to work. People traveling also more for other purposes, more leisure trips. And this increase over the years of the demand in transportation has put our transport infrastructure in stress. And we see that we have more and more congestion in cities, and in public transport, more and more crowding. And with this increase in demand and this increase in congestion, of course, we have also an increase in well, emissions, an increase in pollution, increase in noise, and in delays that we cause each other and time loss. So this is something that we're seeing across the world. And well, basically, what can we do to try to mitigate this issue of increased demand for transportation? Well, on one side, we could think about increasing capacity. We've tried that also in the past, but this increasingly is becoming more and more expensive. And we might also not have the space to add extra lanes on highways or extra rail infrastructure. And as we also know, increasing capacity only solves the problem on the short term. At some point, we'll reach a new equilibrium where the capacity increases will be filled up, and we'll fall back into the same situation. Alternatively, we could think about trying to change travel behavior in an attempt to better utilize the existing infrastructure that we have. And so the rest of this talk will rather focus on this second alternative of what we can do. And in this case, I'll be talking about one way that we could try to change travel behavior, and that is using transport pricing. So for the next, let's say, I don't know, 35 minutes, 40 minutes, I'll try to cover the following topics. So I'll start by discussing transport pricing in brief. What are we talking about? What it is? Does it exist already in the world? And a little bit the context of Switzerland before I dive deeper into the core of this presentation, which will be the MOBIS study, which was a large-scale transport pricing study that we carried out in Switzerland. Then I'll present some of the key results from this study, as well as some follow-up policy implications, and then discuss some current work that we're carrying out at the Institute in relation to this study. So, transport pricing in brief. So the cost of transportation can basically be divided into three main categories. On the one hand, we have individual or private costs of transportation. So these are the costs that are borne by the transport user themselves. And these include, for example, the costs of fuel, the costs of buying a transport ticket, as well as the time spent traveling, among others. And then what we also have are the external costs of transportation. these are the costs that are not borne by the individual themselves, but rather that fall on all of society. And these include delays caused by congestion to other passengers. This also includes greenhouse gas emissions and other climate-related damages that transportation causes, as well as health effects that are caused by emitting pollutions like particulate matter, or due to the stress caused by noise. So these are all costs that that are not, like I said, paid by the individual, but rather that society in turn has to pay externally. And then finally, we also have infrastructure costs, so the costs of laying down roads or extra tracks. And what we know is that individual transport behavior is essentially influenced by these private costs. So the fact that you decide to travel with a given mode at a given time a day along a given route is essentially dictated by how you perceive the different private costs related to travel. And this transport behavior decision rarely includes the external costs on society. And this leads to a form of market failure, because the demand then for transportation, for different modes, different routes, traveling at different times, is basically higher than what would be optimal from a societal point of view, because we're basically underestimating the costs. And this is something that was noticed and discussed over 100 years ago by Pigovian, and basically led to the concept of Pigovian tax, or in our case, Pigovian transport pricing, which the idea here is basically to internalize all these external costs associated with a given activity. So in our case, associated with transportation or travel, by imposing the transport user, in addition to the private costs, also the marginal social damage, so the marginal external costs of the transport as an additional tax. And by doing so, we raise the overall cost of transportation and lower the demand to find a new equilibrium, which is optimal from a societal point of view. And then we have two forms of pricing. So what we call first best pricing, which essentially we're able to calculate all these marginal external costs and charge them directly to the user. So very detailed, precise, and complete. And then we have second best pricing, which is, again, basing the costs on the pricing scheme on the marginal external costs, but rather using a simplified version of the pricing scheme, because, for example, we're not able to track everybody at every given time exactly where they go and see exactly who they're causing delays to, or who they are causing health issues to. And so there have been examples of transport pricing that have been carried out in practice already in the world. Probably the earliest example is the case of Singapore, which already in the 70s had some form of peak hour permits that were being delivered. I mean, a paper-based scheme. And then in the late 90s, they introduced the electronic road pricing scheme, which basically vehicles were charged each time they passed through a gantry. Then I guess maybe one of the most famous schemes is the London road pricing scheme, Congestion Charge, which was first applied in 2003. It's basically a cordon around the central business district that you have to pay a charge if you enter. And then finally, we have also the case of a little bit later, Stockholm, who also implemented a cordon around their central business district, first as a trial in 2006, and then after being accepted in a referendum, was made permanent in 2007. And all these practical examples have been shown to be effective in reducing overall car traffic and reducing congestion and in shifting trips towards other modes like public transport. And so what is the case in Switzerland? So like I mentioned before, Switzerland is not immune to these problems. So traffic is also growing in Switzerland, both on the road and rail network, and especially during peak hours, where we're starting to have capacity problems on highways, notably between Geneva and Lausanne, but also in the greater Zurich area. But otherwise, the network outside of these peak hours is not exploited to its maximum. So it's really a problem of capacity during the peak. And the issue is basically that increasing this capacity, especially in the densely populated regions of the urban agglomerations, is nearly impossible. On the one hand, because it's very expensive to do so, to add new track or new roads, but also because there's a lack of space. And therefore, as an alternative to increasing capacity, the Swiss Confederation decided to start examining the option of transport pricing as a solution to basically curve demand outside of these peak hours and better use the network capacity throughout the day. And so this leads me quite naturally to the MOBIS study. So this is basically a study that was instigated through this interest from the Swiss Confederation to look at mobile or transport pricing in Switzerland. And so the MOBIS study, which is basically an acronym for mobility behavior in Switzerland, was a study that tried to answer the following research question. So basically, what are the effects of economic incentives, so pricing, and information on individual mobility behavior? Basically, does transport pricing or does information about external costs, and then on top of that, transport pricing have an effect on how people behave? And therefore, would it be a viable option to implement within Switzerland? So how we went about to examine this question was by conducting a randomized controlled trial back in fall of 2019. The trial consisted of 2 4-week phases. So in total, it was an 8-week study consisting of both an observation and a treatment phase. We had 3 different treatment groups, so a control group, an information group, and a pricing group. We recorded individual GPS traces of over 3,500 participants. We imputed the externalities that each user produced and then provided the users feedback and measured the effects on their travel behavior. So this is just in a nutshell. I'll, of course, go into a little bit more details of all these different steps. And this project was also a collaboration between 3 different institutes. So in addition to our chair at the ETH in Zurich, there was our other project partners were also the University of Basel, so a team of economists there, as well as the Zurich University for Applied Sciences. And so this, of course, project was not just one group, but yeah, it was a joint collaboration between the 3 institutes. And so in more detail, how did the study look like? So like I said, it was conducted back in the fall of 2019. So the study started in September of 2019. And essentially what we did there is we sent out invitations to over 90,000 people living in urban agglomerations in the French and German-speaking regions of Switzerland. So we sent basically letters to 90,000 addresses, 60,000 that we received from the Federal Statistical Office. So we're sure that they represent overall social demographics of the country. as well as another extra 30,000 that we sent via a private vendor. And essentially what the participants received was a letter telling them that, or inviting them to participate in a study on mobility behavior in Switzerland. So there was no mention in this first invitation letter about anything regarding transport pricing, obviously because we did not want to expose the nature of the study. So basically we told them that we would be inviting them to a study where we would just ask them some questions in a survey and then track them for a few weeks to try to understand how people in Switzerland behave from different regions, different social demographic backgrounds. And in this letter, they received a link to a first initial survey where we asked them different questions about their social demographics, but also questions about their transport behavior and opinions on different transport-related topics. And about, let's say, over 20,000 participants accepted this invitation and filled out the survey. And then from these responses, we basically filtered out participants according to several different criteria that we wanted to have within our tracking sample. So notably, the most important criteria was that the participants should be aged between 18 years old and 65 years old. They should be regular users of a car, since we're interested in seeing how both information and pricing affect transport behavior. We wanted to have people that actually could change their behavior, or where there was an interest in seeing if we could change their behavior. So we focused on people that drive or use a car at least 2 days a week. And then there were other conditions that these people needed to be able to be mobile, so walk at least 200 meters on their own, and basically that. And so after this filtering, we had just under 4,000 participants who joined the actual GPS tracking survey, so this smartphone-based randomized control trial. And basically what the participants were then asked to do was to download a GPS tracking app, which I will show you a little bit more in detail on the further slides. And they were asked basically to install this app, to let themselves be tracked. And this tracking app then would detect the trips and the modes for the next 8 weeks. And then, so this is the first phase where we just observed what people were doing. And then after 4 weeks, phase 2 of the study started, where we separated our panel into 3 different groups of roughly equal size randomly. So we first had a control group, which essentially it was business as usual. They continued to just track. And then we had 2 extra groups, the information group and the pricing group. And at this point, what happens is that the information group started receiving not only as in the phase 1 information, basic information about their travel, but they also started receiving information about the external costs of their mobility. So the health, the congestion, and the climate-related costs of their travel. And then the pricing group on top of that not only received the same information about external costs, but were also provided with a budget from which these external costs would be deduced. And so the study continued now in this kind of new format with 3 groups for an additional 4 weeks, after which all the participants were invited to complete a final survey where we again asked them about different opinions that they had regarding transportation, values, lifestyles. We included a stated choice experiment. We asked them also some questions related to the study itself, and to try to understand at which point they, or to what extent they understood how the study correctly. And after filling out this survey, we basically then paid the incentive to all participants who completed the study. So everyone received 100 francs for participating in all these different steps. So initial survey, the tracking, and the final survey. And those in the pricing group, on top of that, received whatever was left on their mobility budget as an incentive for them to change the behavior. So that's essentially how the study was designed. Now, like I said, the core of the study was, again, this 8-week randomized controlled trial, which was conducted using a GPS tracking app. And for this purpose, we used a tracking app called Catch My Day, which was developed by a German firm called Motion Tag. And the app looks something like this. So basically, the participants had this calendar overview where they would see basically each day circled here where they had tracks. In black would be a day where in red, sorry, would be a day where the participant had new tracks that appeared. And the participants then were given the opportunity within the app to look at each GPS trace in detail, and then also to apply corrections. So like I said before, what the app does is essentially collects the GPS data, it segments the data, it segments it into trips and activities, and then it tries to impute the mode of transport for the different trips. And each time a new trip appears in the app, it shows up in red, and then the participant has the option to then validate the trips that were imputed. So they can edit the transportation mode, they can tell us that the trip did not occur. They can also enter the type of activity that they were conducting. And once they do this, then this little point will turn black, and that means that they've validated the day. What I wanted to say, we did not impose that the participants validate everything. They didn't have to, but we kindly encourage them to do so to improve the accuracy, of course, of the study. And then, as the trips were being segmented or detected by the app and segmented, we had to then estimate the external costs of all these trips. So what we did there is basically from the app, we have the different trip legs that are being segmented and the GPS data associated to them. And then we have this first pipeline here that filters these GPS points in terms of distance between points and other basic metrics. Then, like I said, the app obviously imputes the mode. If the mode, then what we did after we have the different GPS points and different modes that are imputed, we then went on to, for the car trips, to map match these car trips to the underlying road network. And to do so, we used the Grasshopper. We use Grasshopper for map matching, and we map match to the MatSim network. So we basically did this all within the MatSim framework. We map match the car trips to the underlying MatSim network. We then calculate the link entry and link exit times for the routes. And basically what we're doing, the idea here is that we're converting all these trips into MatSim events. because we will then be using MatSim to further process or further compute the external costs. So for car, we have the map match. For everything else, we just need to know the start and end times. We don't need to match them to the network. And then what we do is we process these MatSim events with an extended MatSim framework for external cost estimation, which basically consists of 3 different modules. So we have here the emissions module, which is based on the emissions factors from the handbook for emissions factor analysis. So these are standard values of basically pollutants that are emitted per distance, and these values basically depend on different characteristics of the driving patterns. So whether or not the motor is in a hot or cold state, the speeds, the road types, basically. And so this allows us to get a very, once we've map matched the car trips to the network, to then get a very detailed profile of the emissions along the route. We also have a congestion module, which basically assigns the average marginal congestion that we calculate or that we estimate using our MatSim scenario for Switzerland. So basically from our MatSim scenario of Switzerland, we're able to estimate how much delay on average is being generated on each link at each time of day. And as we have then these MatSim events that have been converted from the GPS points, we're able to then assign these average values from the scenario to the individual trips that we're observing. And then once we have both congestion and all the emissions, we're then able to monetize all these externalities given Swiss norm values for cost-benefit analysis. And then this gives us the externalities for each trip that we record in the tracking app. Now, of course, it's not enough to just record or compute the externalities, but we also, I think I will skip this slide. We also need to then convey this information back to the participants. So what we do is we provide then the participants with weekly reports on their mobility. So like I said before, during the first 4 weeks of the study, we basically were sending participants on a weekly basis an email that looked something like this. So giving them an overview of how many days that we were able to track them and the distances that they traveled per each mode of transport. And then for the second half of the study, the control group would continue to receive only this basic information. Then after, in phase 2, people that were placed into the information group would additionally start receiving information that looks something like this. So they would have a breakdown of the external costs that they caused in the previous week, both by type, so health costs, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as congestion, and by mode of transport. And everything, like I said, monetized. And then finally, the pricing group on top of this would be given a budget. This budget was provided to them or estimated based on the external costs that they produced in the first 4 weeks. So it was tailored to each individual participant. And then from this budget, we would deduce the amounts of external costs that they produced each week, with the promise that anything that was remaining on the budget at the end of the study would be paid out to them. So that was a brief overview of essentially what we did during the study, how we conducted the experiment. And now I'd like to look at a few basic results. So first, I'd like to just present the overall treatment effect that we observed during the experiment. So what this graph is showing is basically the percent change in external costs that are produced by here the type of external cost, and also categorized by the different treatment groups. And the dotted line here is the reference point of the control group. So basically what this shows is that in total, when considering all external costs, pricing and information, or providing both pricing information, result in a 5% decrease of the total external costs during the course of the treatment phase. Whereas here information result in a lower percent change, and the error bars here are the 95% confidence interval. So basically what we're seeing here is that information is providing information alone does not result in a statistically significant reduction in external costs. And what we also see is that the largest contributor to the reduction was basically congestion. Congestion is how would I say, the externality that we saw the greatest change in. And then in green here, what we see is basically the difference between the two different treatment effects. So here, this is, like I said, pricing plus information jointly. So the third treatment group, this is information alone. And by taking the difference of two, we see the additional contribution of pricing to information. So it's essentially the difference between these two. And if we basically then divide this percent change in external costs by the additional cost that people have to, in the average additional cost that people in the pricing group incurred during the study, we are able to calculate that, or we come with an elasticity of negative 3.1%. So essentially what we're saying is that that an increase in about 10% of the transport costs due to taxing external costs would lead to a reduction on average of external costs by 3.1%. So this is the overall effect that we see. Then we looked at the heterogeneity throughout the sample, so whether or not different attributes affected these estimates, so whether gender or education or age, income have an effect. And for most of them, we see that there's essentially very little difference between the different categories. Basically, the main effect that we see is here. This one is the largest effect. This is basically in the final survey. We asked participants whether or not, or we tried to gauge whether or not they correctly understood the experiments, whether or not they understood the concept of transport pricing, whether or not they understood whether that they could actually gain money by changing the behavior. And basically what we see is that people who understood this concept correctly, we saw a significant reduction in their external costs, whereas those who did not understand the concept, basically the difference is statistically insignificant. Now, okay, so we see that transport pricing is successful in reducing the overall external costs. But the question then is how or what are the mechanisms that are underlying this reduction in external costs. And of course, there are several ways that this can happen. So what these plots are showing here is in the first panel here, we're looking at the percent change in the distance traveled by mode, and then here the change in congestion. And what we see is that, and this is of course for people in the pricing group. So what we see here is that pricing does not significantly reduce the overall daily travel, but there is a significant reduction in the distance traveled by car, which is then countered by a relative increase in the distance traveled by public transport, cycling, and walking. Now, of course, this decrease in distance could be a combination of two things. It could be, on one hand, shorter distances traveled by the participants, but also shorter distance traveled by car, by the participants, but also could also indicate a lower probability of using the car in the first place, so shifting to other modes. And what we also see is that pricing significantly reduced the congestion costs per kilometer of car travel. So the external costs of congestion for car. So we see that there was a big decrease there. So what this indicates is that modal shift is not the only mechanism that we see that is underlying this reduction in external costs. Another mechanism is basically the fact that people are shifting to other routes or significantly shifting their departure times. And we noticed that there was a significant shift in departure times, especially for car trips in the morning peak. And so what we've seen so far is that transport pricing does have an effect. And we understood now the mechanisms of how this is going about. But even if this works, not only does implementing this in practice face challenges, both in terms of technology, but also in terms of data, but also we need to have a certain level of social acceptability, right? Because if the people are against, especially in Switzerland, where any new law has to pass through a referendum, right? So in order to gauge the social acceptability of transport pricing, we basically asked the participants in the introduction survey, amongst a bunch of other questions regarding their opinions of transport, whether or not they agreed with the following three statements. So the first statement was the introduction of time and route-specific mobility pricing. Do you agree with the introduction of time or route-specific mobility pricing made revenue neutral by lowering other taxes? Then the second statement was the price of mobility should reflect the social costs. So that means including health, environmental, and congestion costs. And third, the transport network should be used more efficiently by introducing dynamic pricing. So those were three questions, like I said, that were asked within a battery of other questions in the introduction survey. And what we see is that there's a majority of respondents who are either positive or neutral when the question is worded with respect to social costs or externality pricing. However, on the other hand, people are rather opposed to concepts of dynamic pricing. So what this suggests here is that transport pricing could in principle find a political majority, but it very much depends on how the pricing scheme is communicated. So in summary, what the results of the study show is that people respond to both pricing information together, and we calculated an elasticity of minus 0.31. So like I said, with an increase of external costs overall of 10%, we have a decrease, or with an increase of the total cost of transportation due to taxing the external costs of 10%, we have a reduction of 3.1% in the total external cost produced. This is for both pricing information together. Information alone does not, however, produce a statistically significant effect on external costs. And this reduction in external costs is due to a combination of both shifting away from the car towards other modes, but also when looking at the car, shifting to both less congested times and possibly less congested routes. The effect is relatively homogeneous across the sample with respect to the most important social demographic characteristics, so age, income, education. The main or the biggest difference that we saw when looking at the different factors was understanding the pricing scheme. So a conceptual understanding of the pricing scheme is essential for this to work. And finally, transfer pricing could find a political majority in Switzerland, depending on how it is communicated to the public. And so a little bit of the next steps. So once we finished the study, it was kind of quite interesting, but basically a few weeks after, the Confederation announced that it wanted to start allowing pilot projects on transfer pricing to take place within Switzerland. Now, of course, this is always, this is still a very politically sensitive topic. A lot of people are still against it. There's a lot of discussion, debates within the different parties. Also for partially because at the moment, the constitution, so to say, in Switzerland in somewhat forbids transport pricing, or at least forbids the tolling of roads. So there would have to be some political and legal work to further allow this. But at least it wants to go forward in trying to promote pilot projects, actual pilot projects in the field, in different cities or cantons. And so far, there's been 13 propositions that have been made so far by different cantonal or municipal authorities they've expressed interest in conducting such studies. So it's now very, still a hot topic, and we'll see how this continues in the future. So now first, maybe very quick on some current work that we're still doing with respect to this study. So some of you might have heard of this, but basically the MOBIS study finished in January 2020. That's when the last participants finished tracking, and we paid out the last of our incentives. And quite luckily, a few months, or basically a month after that, COVID hit. And we noticed that we still had a quite substantial share of participants who were still using the app. And we thought it would be a very good opportunity to, well, basically measure the impacts of the COVID pandemic on mobility in Switzerland, since we just had measured basically 4 months of normal behavior, more or less normal behavior of people. And we still had these people using the app. So essentially what we did is we just re-invited all our participants to start tracking again, telling them that they would contribute to us better understanding the pandemic. And this has actually been something that is ongoing for the last now 2 years. We still have about 500 people who are still tracking actively every day. I won't go into any details of any of the findings, but I've put down here a link to our project webpage with respect to this. I can open it already here. And here what you will find is essentially all the reports that we've been publishing on Mobiz COVID. So different analysis we've done. It's not loading very quickly. Here we go. So essentially, we've looked at the impacts of the COVID pandemic across different dimensions of mobility. So for those who are interested, this link is here. If you're interested in discussing this, feel free to ask, and we can kindly look at that. And then finally, maybe just very quickly, one thing that I'm currently working on, because this is, I mean, just to put it in perspective, we have an immense database now that we've collected of mobility behavior in Switzerland. I mean, nearly 4,000 people, at least 8 weeks of tracking, if not more. Some people have been tracking for years. So we can look at a lot of other aspects of transport behavior outside of transport pricing with this data set. For example, currently I'm interested in parking search behavior, so I'm looking at different. I'm looking at the GPS traces of participants in urban environments and seeing how they travel through the network and how they make decisions, or how they orient themselves in the network when it comes to parking or looking for a place to park at their destination. We have colleagues that are looking at cycling behavior and cycling route choice. So there's a whole vast area of ongoing work with this very large data set. But for now, I'd like to already conclude this presentation, and I make myself available now for any questions that you might have. Thank you.